I don't write in a logbook after dark anymore. That's not a professional standard. Nobody trained me to think that way. That's just something I do now. I want to start with the facts because they're strange enough on their own, and I don't want you thinking I'm exaggerating anything that comes after. December 15th, 1900. The Flannan Isles, 7 miles off the coast of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides, a scatter of uninhabited rock in the North Atlantic, home to nothing but a lighthouse and the 3 men who kept it. A passing steamer notices the light isn't lit. Word reaches the mainland. The relief vessel Hesperus sails out through bad weather to check on the keepers, and when she arrives, there's no flag raised to greet her, no response to her whistle, and the landing stage is empty. A search party goes ashore. The lighthouse is in perfect working order. The lamp is trimmed and ready to be lit. Inside, 1 chair is knocked over. 1 oilskin coat is missing from its peg. The other 2 are still hanging where they should be. There's no sign of a struggle, no note, no bodies, and no trace of any of the 3 keepers has ever been found from that day to this. The last log entry, written days before the Hesperus arrived, described a violent storm. No other station or ship in the region recorded that storm that week. I've spent 20 years doing structural conservation on lighthouses for the Northern Lighthouse Board. I know the Flannan case the way anyone in my line of work does, as a story you hear early and never quite finish hearing. I never expected to be the one standing in that tower. My husband died 18 months ago. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, except to say that I took the Flannan restoration contract partly for the work and partly because 6 weeks alone on an uninhabited island sounded, at the time, easier than 6 more weeks in a house that still had his coat on the hook by the door. I want that on the record because I think it matters later. I wasn't in a state to notice things I should have noticed. The Heritage Trust that manages the site wanted the old logbook cabinet, the actual keeper stand, restored, never used since 1900, reinstalled as a display piece. As part of the living history framing, they wanted me to keep a modern maintenance log in that same cabinet during the restoration, using the same format the original keepers would have used: weather, lamp status, any incidents. It seemed like a nice touch. I didn't think about it as anything more than that. I was handed a box of paperwork from the previous contractor: restoration notes, receipts, inventory. His invoice was marked paid in full. His project ended 6 weeks early, with no closing report, which in 20 years of trust paperwork I had never once seen. Nobody offered an explanation, and I didn't think to ask for one. Taped to the inside of the cabinet door, in handwriting that wasn't his, I checked later, it wasn't, was a single instruction: log before dusk, never after. If it's already dark, wait until morning. I assumed it was local superstition, the kind of thing that gets folded into a heritage site's character. I left it taped where it was. The boat that dropped my supplies was captained by a man from Stornoway who'd ferried 3 previous contractors out to that island. He wouldn't stay to help me unload. He cut the engine on the moment the sun touched the horizon and was already reversing off the landing before I'd gotten the second crate ashore. I asked him why he was in such a hurry. He didn't answer so much as he left before the sentence finished. I remember thinking that was rude. I think about it differently now. I settled in. Days were spent on the lamp mechanism, which was in worse shape than the trust assessment had suggested. Gearwork seized, brass fittings pitted from a century of salt air. It was good work, focused work, the kind of work that doesn't leave room to think about anything else, which I think is part of why I took the job in the first place. I kept the logging ritual. I liked it, honestly. Writing the entry before dusk, same as the tape note instructed, same as the original keepers would have done 125 years earlier. It felt like a small act of respect. I didn't think of it as a rule I was following. I thought of it as a rule I was choosing to honor. 4th evening I was absorbed in the lamp's rotation gearing and missed the cutoff by maybe 20 minutes. I wrote the entry anyway. I remember thinking the whole thing was theater, a nice detail for tourists, not a genuine hazard, and I wrote it exactly the way I'd written the other 3. The next morning, that entry read differently than I remembered writing it. Not the content. The content was accurate, factual, exactly what I have logged. The handwriting was different, tighter, more slanted than mine usually runs, like it had been written in a hurry or like someone had picked up partway through a sentence and finished it for me. I told myself it was fatigue, poor light, cold hands. I've written thousands of field reports in worse conditions than a lighthouse kitchen at dusk. I know what my handwriting looks like when I'm tired. This wasn't that. Going through the previous contractor's boxed materials, not the trust paperwork, a personal notebook mixed in with it, the kind you're not supposed to find in a project handover, I found entries that stopped the same week as invoice was marked paid. The last legible one described hearing 3 distinct sets of footsteps on the spiral stair at night, though he was alone on the island. He noted, almost as an aside, that he'd started sleeping in a tent on the far side of the island instead of the tower, and that he intended to mention it to the trust when he got back to signal range. I radioed the mainland office and asked why he'd left early. The coordinator's answer was vague, health reasons, unspecified, and she seemed eager to end the call before I could ask a follow-up. The handwriting wasn't wrong exactly. It was mine the way a photocopy of your signature is yours. I decided to stay in the tower rather than move to a tent, partly professional stubbornness, partly because there was, genuinely, nowhere else worth going. I want to be honest that after that I got disciplined about it. I set an alarm for an hour before sunset every day, no exceptions, because some part of me had already decided the rule mattered even though I couldn't have told you why. But the entries kept changing anyway, not every night. Just some mornings there'd be an additional line at the bottom of what I'd written, brief, factual, in the same format as the rest of the log, matching the tone so precisely that if I hadn't been checking, I might never have noticed it wasn't mine. I started photographing every page the moment I finished writing it. Timestamp. I told myself this was standard documentation practice. It wasn't. I know what I was actually doing. One morning, a photograph showed an entry noting a fault in the fog signal mechanism, a full day before I actually found that fault during inspection. I checked the timestamp 4 times. It held up every time. I radioed the trust again, trying to get someone to authorize an early end to the contract, or at minimum send a second person out to the island with me. I need you to understand this isn't a maintenance issue, I said. The log is showing entries I didn't write, describing faults before I found them, and we're getting some interference on this end, the coordinator said, cutting across me. Can you repeat the last part? I said the log has entries I didn't write, lines that appear after I have already. You're breaking up. I'm going to try you again tomorrow. The line went dead. My equipment showed full signal strength the entire time. During a structural inspection behind the restored cabinet, I found a fragment of paper wedged into the stonework, matching the exact paper stock the original 1900 logbook was written on, which the trust had catalogued down to the mill. 3 words in a hand I didn't recognize, torn at both edges, was, "Counted us wrong." Torn on both sides, like someone had wanted to write more, or like someone had stopped them. The footsteps started that week, not 3 sets like the previous contractor described. 1. Slow, deliberate, climbing the spiral stair every night and stopping exactly at the landing outside my door, going no further. 4 nights in a row. On the 5th night, a delayed supply drop kept me out on the landing rocks past sunset, and by the time I climbed the tower stairs, full dark had already come down over the island. I told myself I'd simply log the entry a little late and note the deviation, no different than the 4th night. I reached the top of the stairs. The cabinet door was open. I was certain, I am still certain, that I had locked it that morning. The pen was already lying across the open page.
The pen was resting across the open page, as though someone had set it down only moments before I reached the top of the stairs. I didn't touch it right away. I stood in the doorway and I looked at the stairwell behind me, which was empty. I want to be precise about that, because precision is the only thing that's kept this account useful to me since. The stairwell was empty. I hadn't heard anything descend past me. I hadn't heard the footsteps retreat at all. They had simply stopped, the way they stopped every night at that landing, except this time the door was open and the pen was down, and I was standing in it. The fog signal sounded once, a single low note, out over the water, and then nothing. I need you to understand what that means. The fog signal at that station had been disconnected from any power source for over a decade as part of the restoration project. There was no mechanism attached to it that could produce a sound. I checked the wiring myself, twice, in the 2 days before the drop that stranded me on the rocks. It was dead. It had been dead the entire time I'd been on that island. It sounded once, low and close, the way a foghorn sounds when a ship is nearer than you'd like. Then the island went back to being as quiet as an island that size gets, which is to say not quiet at all. Wind, water, gulls even at night. Just quiet of the one thing that shouldn't have made a sound in the first place. I didn't read the open page that night. I want that on the record too. I closed the cabinet. I did not lock it because I no longer trusted that locks meant anything in that tower, and I sat in the kitchen with my back to a wall until it was light. 2 days later, I was off the island and back in signal range, and a retired Northern Lighthouse Board historian I'd contacted weeks earlier, before any of this, when I was still treating the case as research rather than something happening to me, finally returned my call. He was reluctant. I could hear that in the first 10 seconds, the particular reluctance of a man who has decided in advance how much he's willing to say. He told me something the official 1900 inquiry never made public. The Lighthouse's own logbook that final week recorded 3 consecutive days of a hurricane-force storm. No other station in the region logged that storm. No vessel passing through those waters logged it either. He said there's been an unverified rumor in board historian circles for a century, never published, dismissed as folklore by everyone with a professional reputation to protect, that whoever kept that log in the keeper's final days wasn't actually logging the weather. I asked him what he meant. There's a theory, he said, never printed anywhere serious, that something else was being counted. I asked him to explain what he meant by that.
He said he'd already said more than he meant to, and the call ended shortly after. I didn't understand it, not that night, not on the ferry back to the mainland. I want to tell you I put it together through some clever piece of research, but that's not what happened. What happened is I went home to my flat, and before submitting my photographed log pages to the trust as part of the final restoration report, I went through them one more time, in order, from the first night to the last. The very first entry, night 1. Before the taped instruction had meant anything to me, before the boat captain refused to meet my eyes, before any of what came after. That first page, in the photograph on my own camera roll, time-stamped to the same minute I finished writing it, had an extra line at the bottom that I did not write and do not remember reading when I photographed it. 3 keepers accounted for. 4th arrival noted. I have never once, in 20 years of documentation work, forgotten taking a photograph. I checked the timestamp 4 times. It was there from the first night. It had been there the entire time. I simply hadn't looked closely enough, early enough, to see it. I finished the contract by correspondence. I never went back to the island in person, and I told the trust it was for personal reasons, which was true, if not complete. The restored cabinet is on public display now. Visitors can see the original 1900 logbook and the modern maintenance log side by side, presented as a nice piece of living history. I never told anyone at the trust what the modern log actually contains. I go back sometimes to the plain facts of the case, the ones I opened with. No bodies were ever found. The official inquiry concluded only that 1 or more of the keepers had likely been swept from the rocks by a rogue wave, a conclusion that has never once accounted for the missing oilskin coat, or the overturned chair, or the fact that the weather logged that week doesn't match any other record from anywhere else in the region. I used to find that inconclusiveness frustrating, the not knowing of it. I don't anymore. I think I understand now that the not knowing was never a gap in the record. I think it was the record. Here's the detail I haven't told the trust, or the boat captain, or anyone but you. I never described the exact wording of the added log lines to the retired historian, not in my first message to him, weeks earlier, and not in the call where he finally told me about the storm. I checked my own records to be sure of that. Before I'd said a single word about what the entries actually contained, he asked me one question, first thing before I could stop him. Did it say accounted for? I never confirmed it to him. I still haven't asked him how he knew what to ask.